Being the real goat of chess, Magnus Carlsen has incorporated the new, absurd, but surprisingly successful goat horns opening in his opening repertoire. And initially, the way Carlsen plays it is he goes a6 on move 1 against any moves of white, and on the next move he continues it with yet another absurd looking move, pawn c6. Now at first this seems like some internet trolling, but then I was surprised to know that Carlsen actually scored 82% win rate with black pieces while playing against Hikaru Nakamura, Caruana, and other strong players. I was really intrigued and decided to figure out what the heck is going on here, and indeed it turned out that there is something interesting, so let's check this out together. In this position, white usually goes knight f3, but actually black is going to play same moves regardless of what white does here, and now black goes d5, attacking this pawn on e4. Now, white can defend it differently. In most cases, they push it forward, but actually black is going to stick to the same plan. Now, after e5, we can see that it actually transposed almost into the Carlsen defense with this c6 and d5 pawn structure, and the only difference is that black has this pawn on a6 while white developed the knight on f3. And at first it looks like it's actually better for white to develop a knight versus black wasting time on this side pawn movement. However, in reality, there is something interesting here. Let's go back to the Carlsen position, alright? So in Carlsen, black goes c6 and then d5, and now as we go e5, again, it's very similar pawn structure, but here's the issue. Black usually has some problems with development of this bishop. Black would wish to develop it to g4, but right now they can't do it because white queen controls this square, and that would simply drop a bishop for black. If instead they try to develop the other bishop, like this way, then the bishop got completely stuck behind the pawn wall and just can't get out. And if the bishop is developed to f5, the only normal available square, like, it's fine, this is still theory, but white has a bunch of attacking options, including even the most aggressive g4 going after this bishop, sometimes then h4, h5, and yes, black can play it, but it's very complicated. Going back to Carlsen's trick, now after a6 and c6 we kind of transpose it back into the similar position, but now with this knight on f3 already, black can actually develop his bishop to the most desirable square g4, where first of all it's outside the pawn chain, and also it's putting pressure on this knight, which solidifies the center for white, so therefore black actually achieves something pretty nice. And also it turns out that this move pawn a6, although right now it's not super critical for black to have the pawn right here, but usually down the road black would play this move anyway, therefore it's not a complete waste of time. It's just like reordering moves. And after this, usually white goes bishop e2 to neutralize this pin, then black plays e6 to complete the pawn chain, white castles, and now there are different ways for black to go about this. The easiest is to strike in the center right away with the move pawn c5. And now we're getting kind of like the French defense pawn structure, but having our bishop being very active on g4 instead of having it back there on c8 where it's completely passive. And so after c5, our idea is to hit the center. We want to split up the pawns and attack them. Even if white defends them, we want to go knight c6 and put more pressure to these two squares. And this is our long-term plan. And quite often white actually starts feeling troubles because of that. For example, at some point white may play h3, and we actually don't mind trading off this bishop, because what we do is we take away this knight from f3, which was defending these two key areas which we are about to attack. Therefore, if your pawn goes h3, it is okay actually to trade off, and then you can even trade on d4 just to keep this pawn on d4 isolated. There are no pawns on adjacent files that could possibly defend it, so you can put more and more pressure against this pawn. And one common way of that would be queen to b6, where we already attack it twice, and actually there is no easy way for white, in fact no way at all, to defend this pawn, because if they try to bring the bishop out, that's gonna lose this pawn on b2. Therefore, queen b6 is one good way of going about things. Another typical maneuver is moving the knight from here to f5, and now we're going to hit the pawn as well. So we go knight e7, let's say white develops, and then you play knight f5, adding the other attacker to this pawn. Now it's attacked twice, they have to guard it, and after that you can just complete your development, and again you have like superior version of the French defense where you traded off your bad bishop already. Now you're attacking, white is actually the one defending, so they have to be really careful. For example, if white plays something, quite often they play something like a3, you can just castle, and then you can put your rook to the c file. It's a very good idea. You keep putting pressure to this pawn on d4. There's also one interesting idea, by the way, which I want to share with you, because I actually got to know it when I was an international master already. Now, initially in this pawn structure, this bad bishop on e3 is considered to be a passive and bad piece for white. It's called a bad bishop for a reason, right? It's restricted by his own pawns and it looks like a tall pawn. So normally black feels good about white having this passive piece. However, in the current position, it actually makes sense for black to trade it off because although the bishop is indeed passive, it cements the position. You can't attack this pawn on d4 any longer. And therefore, one interesting move and counterintuitive move, because you kind of trade off his bad piece, but it's a good move to play, it's bishop g5. You want to take away this bishop, and if he actually trades it off, after that this pawn on d4 will be left undefended and you will be able to capture it. Moreover, even if white tries to avoid this and tries to defend the bishop, there is also another interesting tactical trick. Now, you don't have to remember it all. I'm just sharing with you different common attacking patterns in this opening, which you can use, and in many other openings as well, actually, because the pawn structure is common. You can trade. Now, this pawn on e3 becomes a new weakness. You can hit it once again with queen g5, or attacking it twice, and as white defends it somehow, you can then, all of a sudden, capture the pawn on d4 anyways. Quite an unpleasant surprise. It turns out that the pawn on e3 is pinned, and if white lightheartedly captures your knight, they're going to lose the queen. And even if they don't capture your knight, well, they're down a pawn, plus you're going to move this knight away or trade it off, and then they're going to also lose this pawn on e5. So you're actually winning 2 pawns in a row, getting a completely winning game. And here we have Magnus Carlsen playing black against Hikaru Nakamura. Now, Nakamura probably realized that black is going to play d5, and he decided to shut down this plan by going d5 himself. Now, Carlsen responded with knight of 6, putting pressure to these both pawns. White defended it. After that, Carlsen traded on d5, and Nakamura decided to play more aggressively, because when your opponent plays something like pawn a6, c6 on first moves, that feels like something terrible, and white naturally wants to punish black. But this is actually a deceptive feeling, because in fact, black plays, well, maybe not the mainstream, but still a fairly decent chess opening, so there's no way for white to really punish black for anything. However, Nakamura has tried to do that. He plays e5, attacking the knight, and after the knight goes, white captures this pawn on d5. And initially it looks like white is more advanced, while this knight on e4 maybe is a little bit hanging, maybe white wants to attack it somehow and gain temples. However, Carlsen goes e6, now the knight is attacked, and an interesting thing is it cannot return back to c3, because then black would take right there, and that would ruin white's pawn structure. White does not want that. Therefore, Nakamura returned the knight back to e3 right here, but after that it turns out that queen a5 is actually a double attack, and white also did not want to cover with a bishop, because white can take it with his knight, so white played c3, now queen takes e5, and black snatched the pawn and clearly outsmarted white within just a couple of moves, which is a pretty great outcome for that weird goat's horns opening used by Carlsen, getting a technically winning position within a couple of moves. On a side note, one interesting moment occurred in this game down the road. Since it was an online blitz game played in Title Tuesday, there was a lot of crazy things going on in this game, and down the road they both missed an interesting opportunity that I want to use as a little tactical challenge for you. It's black to play and win, and if you can't find the right move for black, please write it down in comments below. By the way, recently I realized that people are searching for my name on TikTok while I was not on the platform. Therefore, I decided to be there, and now you can find me. I'm GM Igor Smirnov on TikTok. You can click the link in the description below this video, and if you're looking for some quick chess tips, opening traps, and different fun videos, you can find me now on TikTok as well. An interesting thing happened after that. Once Hikaru realized that this weird opening is actually not too bad, he started playing it himself a week after he figured out that Carlsen is using this. So in this game, Nakamura is playing black against Toncheva, and this time you can see that white played d4, the queen's pawn move first, but it doesn't change anything for black because their plan is weirdly simple. Now e4, c6, the same stuff. This time white played knight c3, bringing up the other knight instead, d5, knight f3. Now, white hasn't played pawn e5 in this game, but guess what? That doesn't change anything for black. You still bring the bishop out to g4, and after that you play e6, completing your rock-solid pawn chain, because that's what black is aiming for. Now, here white played bishop e3, black decided to play knight d7. It's more flexible than bringing the other knight forward, because if you do that, white can play e5 and attack it. And it's not a big problem, it's not the end of the world, but anyway, it's more flexible to bring the other knight first. Now white played queen d2, and here Hikaru played a smart move bishop b4, putting pressure down this diagonal, and it means that now the threat of pawn takes e4 is real, because the knight on c3 is pinned. This forces white to make some decision about this pawn, whether they want to push forward or trade on d5, and in both cases it will be easier for black after that to decide where to develop this knight from g8. Anyway, in the game, white decided to just trade on d5, and whenever they do this, that's great for you. They release the pressure, which generally speaking is a bad idea for them, good for you. Now your center is rock solid, completely safe. By the way, should you take with this pawn or with this one? There's a generic rule that says take towards the center, right? So we take with a pawn which is further away from the center towards the center. Now pawn takes d5. Now we also have this nice semi-open file for our rook. And white played a3, attacking the bishop drops back, white castles, knight f6, and although white seemingly played all correct moves, they're actually somewhat in trouble. Now, this pin is annoying, but I can play rook c8 and intensified. There's also knight to e4, which can make use of the same pin, and can put more pressure to this knight and queen. Of course, white could play b4, but the bishop will retreat somewhere, and after that, at some point, black will still play rook c8, and now all these weaknesses will be a long-term problem for white. In the game, white tried out another thing, knight e5, but then it also didn't solve the problems. Bishop takes c3, so Hikaru took it in the right moment where white can now recapture with a queen, as that will lose this bishop on e2. Therefore, white has to ruin his pawn structure, play pawn takes c3, and now Hikaru missed the in-between move. Knight e4 was very strong, hitting the queen. He just took on e2, but that's also pretty good. And after queen to c7, it turned out that white achieved nothing, and his position is actually pretty bad already. Now black is just attacking these two weaknesses. Also, this knight on e5, and white has nothing to do. Therefore, Hikaru won that game later easily. I mean, it's technically winning for black already. There's one move from white that you gotta be aware of. It's the move pawn to c4. Now, what do you do against this move? Well, then you still play pawn d5. It's the same stuff. But the useful thing to know here is that if white starts capturing right here on d5 many times, you do not take with a queen. I mean, it's not the end of the world, but after that white can play knight c3, hit your queen, and gain a tempo. You do not want that. It is smarter to just play knight f6 and then recapture this pawn with your knight, because having your knight in the center of the board is perfectly fine. In fact, it's good for you, and after that you just complete your development and you've got a good position. So that's what happens if they take on d5 twice. If instead they move the pawn forward in this case, I mean, guess what? You have a superb version of the main line, because not only you got what you wanted, but also you have this natural square c6 for your knight, which is not obstructed by the pawn anymore, so you can just bring your knight out. And on the next move, you want to develop your light square bishop, ideally to g4, if possible, if not, at least to f5. But very often they will play knight f3 here, because they see that you're putting pressure to their center. They want to guard it and, generally speaking, develop. Then you can bring your bishop out to g4, putting pressure here, and after that you play e6, and you get this superior version of the French defense where I'd say that white already needs to be very careful not to lose this pawn quickly. We already know that knight is going to go here, queen is going to go here, and you start putting more and more pressure gradually. By the way, I would really recommend that you check out my video about this pawn structure because it occurs from the French defense, the Carlsen defense, the Sicilian defense, and certain other openings. So it's really useful to understand it. It's going to be helpful long-term across many openings. And check out the video. I have it right here where I explained everything in details, plans for white, for black, and many other useful things. And if you want to hone your positional understanding overall, check out my free masterclass by clicking the link up there.